There's a show that millions of people grew up loving with their whole hearts. A cozy little world they returned to again and again, believing every smile was genuine, every adventure was pure, and every character was exactly what they appeared to be. But underneath that cheerful surface was a story so tangled with jealousy, suffering, deception, and heartbreak that the people who made it could barely stand to be in the same room with one another. And the ending that fans have searched for and mourned for more than half a century, was not stolen from them. It was never real to begin with. What you are about to hear is the complete and unfiltered truth about Lost in Space, the 1965 science fiction series that captured the imagination of a generation and then quietly broke the hearts of nearly everyone involved in making it. This is a story about a villain who was never supposed to survive, a leading man whose dignity was slowly taken from him, a man who cooked alive inside a robot suit, and a secret that rewrote the entire history of American television. By the time you reach the end of this, you will never look at that cheerful Robinson family quite the same way again. To understand why this show matters so deeply even now, you first need to understand what it cost to bring it into existence in the first place. Before a single episode ever aired, before any child had fallen in love with the robot or groaned at Dr. Smith, the creator behind the whole project spent an almost incomprehensible amount of money on a single test film. That creator was Irwin Allen, a grand and theatrical showman who would later become famous for producing some of the most spectacular disaster films of the 1970s, the kind where ocean liners capsized and skyscrapers turned into infernos. People in the industry called him the master of disaster, and that nickname captured everything about the man: his appetite for scale, his love of spectacle, and his absolute refusal to do anything small. The pilot episode he produced for Lost in Space, a version titled No Place to Hide, carried a price tag of roughly $600,000. To put that number in its proper context, that single test film cost more than entire seasons of competing television programs. It was the most expensive pilot that American television had ever produced at that point in history, a staggering gamble on a family trapped in the stars. And here's the detail that will genuinely stop you cold. The two characters that every single person on Earth now associates with this show, the scheming Dr. Smith and the beloved robot, were completely absent from that original version. They did not exist yet. The personality of the show, the soul of the whole thing, was an afterthought added later, stitched in after the original footage was already sitting in the editing room. The network that picked up Lost in Space for broadcast was CBS, and the decision they made in choosing this show over its competition is one of the most consequential and quietly extraordinary moments in the entire history of American entertainment. Around the same time that the Robinson family was being prepared for television, another proposal was sitting on the desks of network executives, a science fiction idea built around a starship and its crew exploring the unknown reaches of space. That proposal would eventually become Star Trek. CBS was offered both concepts, and the people in charge looked at the family adventure and the starship drama side by side and made their choice. They chose the family. They passed on Star Trek entirely, mostly because they already had a space show they believed in, and that was the Robinsons. Star Trek eventually found a home at NBC and premiered a full year after Lost in Space had already made the Robinson family a household name across America. The show that history would eventually crown as one of the greatest and most influential franchises ever created was turned away in favor of a program that most people today would describe as campy and outdated. Yet in that moment, in 1965, Lost in Space was considered the safer and smarter investment. It was the prestige pick. That fact alone deserves a long, slow moment of reflection. Now here is where the story turns, and where the warmth you remember about this show begins to crack around the edges. Dr. Zachary Smith was never meant to be a hero, an anti-hero, or even a recurring presence on the series. He was written as a cold and calculating saboteur, a traitor who tampered with the Robinson family's mission and was designed to either die or simply fade out of the story within the earliest episodes. He was a plot device, not a character. The writers had no grand vision for him, no long arc, no redemption. He was supposed to disappear. The actor who played him, a man named Jonathan Harris, had other ideas entirely. Harris was a theatrical and deeply intelligent performer who understood almost immediately that playing a one-dimensional villain with no humor and no charm would earn him nothing but an early exit from the series. So he began doing something quietly audacious. He started rewriting his own lines. Not dramatically, not in ways that would immediately alert the producers, but steadily and carefully, softening the menace in his dialogue, adding little flourishes of cowardice and self-pity, slipping in moments of absurdity that were never on the page. He invented the elaborate, tongue-twisting insults that his character hurled at the robot, sitting up late at home crafting ridiculous strings of alliterative abuse that became some of the most quoted lines the show ever produced. The producer noticed what was happening. He saw the audience responding with genuine delight to this bumbling, whining, melodramatic fool of a villain, and instead of reining Harris in, he handed him almost total creative freedom. Dr. Smith was allowed to become whatever Jonathan Harris wanted him to be, and what Harris wanted was a character so funny and so strange and so unexpectedly lovable that the audience could never imagine the show without him. He succeeded beyond anything anyone had planned, and in doing so, he accidentally destroyed someone else's dream. That someone was Guy Williams, and his story is one of the saddest in all of classic American television. Williams arrived on Lost in Space as a genuine star, not a hopeful nobody looking for his first break. He had already become beloved across the country playing Zorro for Disney, a dashing masked hero who had made him a household name and a genuine romantic icon. He signed on to lead this new series as Professor John Robinson, the strong and principled father at the center of the family, fully expecting to anchor every episode, drive every story, and remain the figure the audience looked to for courage and wisdom. Instead, he watched the spotlight slide away from him week by week, episode by episode, until he was left standing in the background of scenes that should have belonged to him, delivering lines that barely registered while a comical villain and a talking machine received all the attention, all the best material, and all the affection from the network. The tension on that set was real and it was heavy, and the warmth you saw between the cast members when the cameras were rolling was often a performance layered over genuine resentment. Williams felt profoundly betrayed by a show that had made him promises it never intended to keep. When the series finally ended, he made a decision that almost no famous actor ever makes. He walked away from Hollywood without looking back. He had discovered that in Argentina, his old role as Zorro had made him an almost mythological figure, a hero beloved by an entire nation that treated him with a warmth and a reverence that the Lost in Space set had never offered him. He moved to Buenos Aires, embraced his adopted country with fierce loyalty, and built a quiet and peaceful life far from the industry that had diminished him. He lived there surrounded by adoration until 1989, when he died alone in his apartment from a brain aneurysm at the age of 65. Several days passed before anyone discovered that he was gone. It is the kind of ending that sits in the stomach like a stone. While Williams was suffering in silence on one side of the set, another member of the production was suffering in a far more immediate and physical way on the other. Everyone who watched Lost in Space loved the robot. That boxy, arm-waving, endlessly quotable machine was one of the most recognizable figures in all of 1960s television, a character so beloved that children begged their parents for toys modeled after it. What almost nobody understood was that there was a real human being trapped inside that costume, enduring conditions that were genuinely dangerous. A performer named Bob May wore the robot suit for nearly every appearance the character ever made, and what he experienced in there bordered on torture. The costume was heavy, sealed, and almost entirely without ventilation, and the blazing studio lights pushed the temperature inside it to levels that left him drenched in sweat and struggling to breathe after even short stretches of filming. The earliest version of the suit had internal mechanisms with sharp edges that cut into his legs repeatedly, leaving him bleeding inside a costume that the cheerful audience at home associated entirely with fun and adventure. He could only tolerate being sealed inside for limited periods before the heat and the suffocation became unbearable, and this cycle of misery repeated itself throughout every single season of the show. What makes this detail sting even more is the layer of erasure sitting on top of it. The voice that came out of that robot, the warm and authoritative tones that children loved and quoted and imitated in playgrounds across America, did not belong to Bob May at all. It belonged to a narrator named Dick Tufeld, who recorded the robots' dialogue separately. May gave his body, his blood, his breath, and his endurance to that character, and someone else received the credit that audiences actually heard. The network that broadcast this show had a controlling hand in nearly every aspect of its production, and some of the decisions handed down from those executives were so strange that they sound invented when you describe them today. One of the most remarkable of these involved the relationship between the two adult characters at the center of the Robinson family. In the original pilot, Maureen and John Robinson behaved like an actual married couple in love, holding hands, sharing quiet, affectionate moments, existing together with the natural warmth of two people who had chosen each other and built a family together. An order came from the top of the network, demanding that this stop. The executives had decided that showing physical affection between a husband and wife made the children in the viewing audience feel uncomfortable. So the warmth was stripped away. The hands were separated. The small, tender moments were quietly removed from the frame, and the couple at the center of a show literally about family was forbidden from behaving like a family. It is the kind of decision that reveals how little the people with power sometimes understand about the art they are controlling. The shift in tone that transformed Lost in Space from a serious science fiction drama into something closer to a cartoon happened gradually, but it had a specific and identifiable cause. Midway through the show's run, a program called Batman arrived on American television and became a national obsession almost overnight. It was bright, ridiculous, self-aware, and packed with a kind of gleeful absurdity that audiences could not get enough of. Every other drama on the air suddenly felt gray and slow by comparison, and the people steering Lost in Space made a calculated decision to chase that energy. The colors got brighter. The monsters got sillier. Dr. Smith's antics moved further and further toward pure comedy. The show that had launched as a tense and serious family adventure was now competing for the same audience that wanted camp and chaos and winking humor. The transformation was not the result of one dramatic order from a villain in a boardroom. It was a slow and deliberate drift made by people who were watching the ratings and reacting to what the culture was demanding at that moment. By the time the drift was complete, the show was almost unrecognizable compared to the pilot that had cost $600,000 to produce. Now comes the piece of this story that has taken on a life of its own in the decades since the show ended. The legend that refuses to die no matter how many times it is examined and found to be empty. For years, devoted fans have passed around a beautiful and heartbreaking story, claiming that a proper finale was filmed, a final episode in which the Robinson family at last found their way home to Earth, with emotional reunions and closure for every character. The story says this ending was then deliberately locked away by the network, hidden from the audience that deserved to see it, left to gather dust in a vault somewhere while fans spent decades mourning what they had missed. It is a deeply satisfying story, the kind that explains the absence of closure in a way that feels meaningful rather than simply disappointing. And it is completely untrue. No such finale was ever filmed. There is no vault. There is no hidden reel. The Robinson family never made it home in any version of the show that was ever produced. The real final episode was shot as a perfectly ordinary chapter in the middle of an ongoing story, with the family still stranded, still drifting, fully expecting that another season would follow. The cast and crew had been told they were coming back. New scripts were in development. Nobody was saying goodbye because nobody knew it was ending. The cancellation came without warning, delivered through a series of phone calls that reached the cast one by one, informing them that the show was over and that there would be no return. The reason was not creative failure or falling ratings in any dramatic sense. It was money. The cost of each episode had been climbing steadily, and the audience the show had built by its final season skewed heavily toward young children, who were not the demographic that advertisers paid the highest rates to reach. When the network asked the producer to bring costs down for a potential new season, he refused, insisting the show could not look the way it needed to look on a reduced budget. Rather than negotiate, the network simply let it die. There was no grand dramatic collapse, just a quiet and cold financial calculation that ended one of the most beloved shows of its era. Inside all of this heartbreak and conflict and recycled monster costumes and network interference, something genuinely beautiful was quietly growing. The actor who had hijacked the show, who had rewritten his lines and stolen the spotlight and contributed to the professional diminishment of the leading man, formed one of the most tender and genuine friendships in the history of the production. Jonathan Harris, the clever theatrical man, who had turned a forgettable villain into an immortal comic figure, became something like a second father to the young boy who played Will Robinson. He brought sweets for the cast and crew every single day. He looked after the child with real attention and warmth, and the friendship that developed between them was not a performance for the cameras. It was real, and it lasted. And then there is John Williams, hidden inside the credits of this little space adventure, doing work that almost nobody noticed at the time, was a young and hungry composer, then known informally as Johnny, who was quietly sharpening one of the greatest musical talents the 20th century ever produced. The sweeping, adventurous theme that signaled the start of every episode was composed by the same man, who would later create the most recognized film scores in history. The music that defined an entire galaxy far away. The two notes that made an entire generation afraid of the ocean. The soaring theme that made a boy in round glasses feel like magic. He was here first, working on this show, pouring enormous talent into music that helped carry the Robinsons through the stars. The music outlived the drama. It outlived the bitterness and the canceled contracts and the cold phone calls. It joined the one other thing this show sent out into the world that proved genuinely immortal. A short, urgent phrase spoken by a machine to a child. A phrase so perfectly constructed and so emotionally immediate that it escaped the show entirely and burrowed its way into the everyday language of people who have never watched a single episode. That warning, that simple cry of alarm, carried something inside it that all the conflict and all the recycled props and all the network interference could never touch. It carried the feeling of the show at its purest, the idea that someone